All right, welcome
Okay.
to another Straight Talking Property podcast. And we've got the usual suspects today. Myself, Ashley Banfield. We've got Brett Allegra Wood looking rather handsome at the moment in Singapore. And we've got Immanuel looking like Immanuel in his penthouse. And we've got special guest today, planning consultant extraordinaire, David Kemp. David, if you just want to give a quick bio about yourself, mate, that'd be great.
Yeah. Well, so I've been in property for about 20 years. I practice as a planning consultant, but I've got a background as a chartered surveyor. I've been in agency, been in valuation. I have been called to the bar and been admitted as a solicitor. I've practiced in local authorities as a planning lawyer, and I've worked in private practice as a planning lawyer as well. And we set up DRK Planning about 10 years ago now, just actually celebrated our 11th year anniversary. So set it up in the last recession, coincidentally enough. And then we're now starting to look at some of our own developments as well.
Good. Okay. So I know you've met Immanuel before. What sort of work have you done with Immanuel? Immanuel might want to chip in as well.
Immanuel and I have looked at a few town centre schemes together, mostly in Ealing, some of which are conversion. They've all got the usual planning complex problems to them as well. All a bit of fun. It's all good work.
We looked at a very big scheme.
That's right, in Leicester.
In Leicester, an office conversion that you would think a scheme that's probably in excess of 100 units would be profitable.
Yeah.
And it's far from it. It was a PD conversion with the amount of extra that we could add on. On the face of it, you'd think it was a very, very profitable scheme, but the actual cost to actually build, and that's why it's so important to have, people like David in your corner, the actual resale values compared to the cost to build and the acquisition didn't make it viable at all.
All right, so good. So let's talk a bit about, firstly, why, and we'll chip in Brett and Immanuel and myself on why we've used a planning consultant. But number one, David, why should people use a planning consultant? I know a lot of people get into property and they think it's a cost that they don't need. They could do it themselves, or they speak to an architect and the architect thinks they can do it themselves, and vice versa. So give us a quick rundown and teach us why we need a planning consultant, whether that be a small, conversion or whatever it might be, up to, like Immanuel says, large projects, large schemes.
A lot of it, Ash, has to do with the way that you're trained and the areas that you go through when you're learning to be a planning consultant, but also later on in life when you're actually practicing as a planning consultant as well. So, for instance, if you go to an architect and ask them, can I get planning on a scheme? Architects will generally look at space, and they will generally look at how many units that they can fit in onto the site. But in order to get planning, it's not about whether or not it's the prettiest scheme. Actually, some of the planning schemes I've seen, there's so much compromise on design, they usually aren't the prettiest scheme. But it's all about complying with the planning policies. And so getting the most number of units on the site, building as high as you can, having an idea of scale and mass as an architect is only half the story, because you've also got to understand how the planners think, what they're looking for, what their priorities are. And also you've got things like, for instance, you might be looking at an office or a retail site that doesn't have permitted development any longer. So it might not have permitted development because there's an Article 4 direction, either coming in or about to come in, or there are conditions on a recent planning permission that's come into force, for instance, that's taken those permitted development rights away. And so as a developer, you're taking a risk on somebody's advice to say, that's okay, I think we can do this, when quite frankly they haven't jumped through all the initial planning policy hoops beforehand. And that site might not have the value you think it does. And then Also, there are other things such as, affordable housing that they haven't taken into account, Section 106, SIL costs, and so on and so forth. And that's just on the policy side. So that's the first reason, I would say. It's knowing what the policies are.
Just before you go on, just explain Section 106 for us and affordable housing and that type of thing.
Well, Section 106 is, so for instance, if you are, generally speaking, if you are doing a development which causes some form of harm or impact to the neighbours or to the local road network in terms of extra parking, highways, traffic, and so on and so forth, or environmental considerations such as impact on trees, etc., or even contamination, then there are things that the council will want you to do in your scheme to mitigate that harm. So if that mitigation is in relation to things that you have to do outside the development site, outside the red line boundary of the development site, then that's usually something you have to provide by way of what's called a planning obligation. And that's delivered through a contract between you and the council, which is agreed as part of the planning permission, called a Section 106 agreement. It takes its name from the statutory provision which sets the rules around all that. But that's for where you're delivering those improvements, those mitigations off-site, or affordable housing. So the council wants to see lower cost housing, either for rental or for shared ownership, delivered as part of the scheme, and that also has to be wrapped up as part of that. Also, financial contributions, those normally can't be done by way of planning condition. Those have to be delivered again through a Section 106. Everything else, and usually anything that's within the red line of the site as by way of mitigation, is usually dealt with by way of planning conditions, and those are imposed on the decision notice.
So the Section 106 for most developers is an additional cost, the same as SIL, and it's a way of the planners to get extra money from the developer. However, that can be mitigated with the use of a very good planning consultant, as well as a Section 106 consultant to actually help in that sort of arena.
That's right.
So when we say mitigated, do we also mean that it is negotiable?
It is only on affordable housing, though. So, for instance, if the council comes to you, and we're dealing with a scheme in Suffolk, for instance, at the moment, there is a total of, I think, offhand, just trying to remember, I think it was about £90,000 worth of financial contributions to it. Now, those contributions included contributions towards highways improvements, infrastructure, schools, libraries, so on and so forth. So those sorts of things, this is where a council does not have a community infrastructure levy. Because the whole point about the community infrastructure levy is you pay money to the council so that they pool all that money. So Brett pays some money on his developments. You pay money on your development, Ash. And Immanuel pays money on, and it all goes into a pool, and that's the community infrastructure levy. Okay? So that then goes towards schools, etc.
Just to be clear to everyone, when we talk about SIL, we're talking about the community infrastructure levy. That's the CIL.
Yeah, it's a tax. It's like basically a local tax on development, and that money gets used towards certain things. So, for instance, if it already has a SIL, it can't collect that money again for the same purpose through Section 106. Okay?
Yeah.
That's the first thing. They can't double count. They can't double provide.
Yeah.
So where you are providing that money anyway through SIL, you can't negotiate on that anyway because it's a fixed tariff. There are certain rules around where you can reduce the amount, but I'm not going to go into that in this answer. But on where you're paying, where they don't have a SIL, and therefore you then have to pay that money through the Section 106. Again, they are fixed tariffs. You can't negotiate on those. The only one you can negotiate on normally is affordable housing.
Okay. And are these tariffs, 106 and affordable housing, SIL, for instance, are they fixed nationally or are they by local councils?
Usually by local councils. With the exception of London, they have two levels of SIL. They have the mayoral SIL, where money is collected to pay for Crossrail and any other longer term infrastructure contributions. And then they'll have SILs or community infrastructure levies which are set locally by that local authority, and they will vary depending upon where they are. So the mayoral SIL that you will pay for a development in Ealing will be different from one that you will pay, for instance, further out. It's done by way of zones, like the TFL zone, like the London Underground map, absolutely. So it's done by way of zones. So you'll get some boroughs, say for instance in London boroughs like Westminster, Camden, they have the same SIL for mayor, which is only £50 per square metre. So it's actually, it's quite low, but it's the local SILs that you have to watch out for, and they can be very high in some areas, such as Islington and Camden. They've done their own valuation assessments, and they think developers can afford to pay, because of the higher land values in those areas, they think developers can afford to pay a lot more. So, for instance, they might be, in some cases, £200, £300 per square metre, in addition to paying the mayoral SIL.
Yeah, it's quite a whack.
It is, yeah.
So when we look at residential versus commercial, is commercial included with the 106 and the SIL? Does that affect commercial? Or is commercial affected some other way with some other tariff?
No, you still have to pay it. I mean, it doesn't choose its target depending upon whether or not it's residential or commercial. Mm-hmm. It depends upon how much extra floor space that you add, which is an interesting point, actually. What I would say is, because, for instance, if you buy a house, even if you buy a house for your own purpose, it doesn't matter that you're not going to develop it, sell it, split it up for profit. If you say you buy a house for your own purpose and you decide you're going to go for lots of extensions under permitted development, you're going to max it out. You're going to go for ground floor, first floor, roof level extensions, side extensions, and you start increasing the floor area of that beyond 100 square metres, then you then trigger a liability for SIL. And because a lot of people will associate paying SIL only if they're doing a development, only if they're selling for profit.
So 100 square metres more in addition to your current property will automatically engage some sort of SIL.
Yeah, yes. If you're not changing the use, then you have to pay SIL in any event, unless, of course, let's say it's a house and you convert it to flats, for instance. So that's a change of use. It's actually a material change of use because you're changing a house to flats, and that doesn't require SIL. And there are other reasons why you don't require SIL as well, such as, for instance, on prior approval schemes, office to resi. That may actually be SIL chargeable because there is a change of use that takes place. But because you can basically offset the existing floor space against the new residential floor space, there may be no change there because it's just a change of use, then it's a nil SIL tax.
You know what?
That's how it works out.
Well, I know that with the information you've given so far in this, under 15 minutes, I think any budding developer or property entrepreneur has already saved themselves thousands and thousands of pounds without getting into projects where they know very little about just something like 106 or SIL. So I think I'll say thanks on behalf of everyone for that. Now,
I think a couple of points. Sorry, can I just jump in? I think there's a couple of points that you made were really quite key. I'm sure a lot of people don't know what you just talked about in terms of no SIL liability of a change of use from a house to flats and not triggering SIL. Can you explain that in a bit more detail? Because that's quite a massive point for a lot of developers.
Yeah. So if you've got a house and you want to change its use to flats, so that is a material change of use. You will need planning permission to make that change.
Yeah.
And where you are making that change, you need to fill out a community infrastructure levy form. It's called the additional information form. Goes to the council. You can't get your application validated without it, and it's the template off which they begin to calculate later if they're going to grant approval, how much you'll have to pay in terms of SIL. So that form guides you through all the steps. It's actually quite simple to fill out, but
if you're increasing the size, why is there no SIL If you're increasing the area, why is there no SIL to pay?
No, you're not in. This is where if you're going from house to flats, but no increase in the area.
Okay.
Okay.
That's quite important.
Yeah. So there's no increase in the area. If you do increase the area, and there's a change of use, but you're under 100 square meters, normally there's no SIL to pay.
Yeah.
So that's under 100 square meters of net additional area.
And would that be if somebody else has done adjustments for and done 100 square feet, and then you come in and you want to do another 100? Does that mean that the next 100 doesn't count? You're not going to pay for it, or are they seen as separate events?
Well, it depends if it's been built first. So if they've gone in and they've done 100 square meters, and then they build that out. So that establishes the new existing base.
Yep.
Do you understand? You've got to understand what your base is that you're working from first, and then it's what you build on top. Now, if Brett, you got permission to extend a house by 80 square meters, but then you didn't build out that 80 square meters, and then Immanuel bought the permission off you, and then he wanted to extend it a further 25 square meters. Now that's put him over the threshold. So he then has to pay SIL because it's now cumulative, because the first 80 square meters additional wasn't built. It didn't set a new base. So is that clear? Do you understand how it works?
Is if you buy something with planning and then you go, we'll try and add this onto it. And then
when it's not been built yet. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly
historical checks as well that you need to do as a consultant.
Sorry, what was that, Ash?
There's historical checks that you need to do as well as a consultant.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the way that we normally work is, and coming back to the point that you made earlier about the value of not just earning clients' money, but saving clients' money as well. You know, I don't have to tell you or any of the guys on this call how expensive it can be to make mistakes. And not just from your own point of view, but also, when you're dealing with other people's money and investors' money as well, the impact on your reputation as well to do that afterwards. So one of the best pieces of advice I ever gave was to a client who was thinking of buying a building, which was a very large potential office to resi scheme in Bagshot in Surrey. Now, down in that neck of the woods, they have this thing called SANG, which is Sites for Alternative Natural Green Space. So basically, they've got protected heathland and upland. You can't take your dogs on for a walk up there. And therefore, they set aside these alternative natural green areas where people should go instead. But they have a catchment area, usually of about 5 kilometres, and therefore some towns fall in between two stools. They're not caught by the catchment area for the alternative green space. So they have to provide their own green space. Now, this one was on the market for about 6.5 million. The client was days from making an offer. We looked into it and we said, well, actually, you're going to have to provide, or you're going to have to be serviced by this alternative green space for this area. And after making inquiries with the council, there was nothing around of that nature.
Yeah.
And he would therefore have bought the building. He might have got PD, but under the Conservation and Habitats regulations, which is a separate body of planning law, he wouldn't have been able to occupy it. So it was being completely useless. Completely useless. He couldn't have occupied it unless he provided that green space. So that client, we advised to pull out of that deal. I know somebody who then went in and bought the deal off that trust not long afterwards. And for the best part of the next 18 months to 2 years, they were struggling, at least. I don't know whether or not they managed to get over it afterwards, but they struggled to get any consent and to get it occupied because they didn't have this SANG. Now, we saved that client not just 6.5 million, because you can pull out before that, but then you've got deposit costs, you've got legal fees, and all those sorts of costs as well. So, that was advice that we gave, maybe for a few £100 at the time.
Yeah.
But that client then did a deal for us, or deal with us on the next scheme that we brought to them, which was incidentally for another 6 million quid, but we got PD for them on that one.
Yeah. And just on that, I know people will probably be tapping away madly at their calculators. 100 square meters is 1,076 square feet. It is a substantial addition when you look at some of the micro flats, 300 odd square feet per flat. So it can add a lot to a scheme, and it can be the difference perhaps between profit or no profit. So, don't sneeze at 100 square meters.
No.
So give us a little bit of insight, your experience with planning consultants, etc., and so on, and developments.
Well, I was just going to say, from the end result, which is a couple of times when we've had sites come to us, and the developer will actually, what you realise is they didn't do their maths right at the start because they perhaps didn't hire a planning consultant, because they didn't realise they had these extra costs and things like that. And then what happens is they have to effectively when they get to the end, in order to make money, they have to decrease the spec and finish things off not too well. And when we look at the site, they're desperate to sell it, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, we can't really sell this because you've shortcut this and shortcut that. And the whole deal and who knows what happens to it after that, but invariably, a bank gets hold of it because, the funder gets hold of it because it just hasn't been done right. And I think, the key to this is, your numbers are everything in development. I mean, if you don't get them right up front, it's very hard to change as you go along. And I think that's where the planning consultants can really de-risk you on that side. And I think that's the big lesson that I see from the sales side of it, in selling blocks and that from various developers. And we do struggle now. A lot of the stuff that we do is with larger developers because the smaller developers tend to miss things like this out. And they get these surprises. And then when we're negotiating with them, they're like, I can't afford that because I've just got this extra bill, and you're like, how can you not know this, sort of stuff.
I think it's really important that our industry in terms of development has become very popular over the last few years with different companies training on training courses. However, I would say almost 99% of the time the training courses do not give the average new developer all the tools that they need, and especially planning consultants and planning in the costs. You have to plan in all the different costs. That's why a lot of the schemes that I look at, by the time we put our figures in and added in all the professional fees, including the planning consultant, don't work. You have to put those contingencies in. You have to have that professional advice, because if you don't, you will make mistakes. As a developer, I've made lots of mistakes over the years, but as I've learned and developed, I've made less mistakes by using professionals like David to allow me to mitigate the circumstances. Somebody wants to get in on the call. It really is important that people understand that you have to plan in these professional services and understand where the risks might be. And I always like to look at worst case scenario, not best case scenario. If the scheme works on worst case scenario, if I get anything over and above that, that's fantastic. So using people, a few of the things that David has said today have just been amazing in terms of, just a 20-minute conversation so far of how to help people and to stop you from making very, very costly mistakes.
Well, David came to see our pub. I didn't see you there. It was Jimmy, my business partner, came to see our pub.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
And I think you brought somebody else that you're training with you. And I think within half an hour, you'd saved us tens of thousands of pounds and weeks of time. And the couple of tips that you gave us, we've gone forward with, and all is sweet. So thanks again.
Thank you for that, Ash. You can thank me for that recommendation.
Okay. All right, here we go.
Do you see what he did there? He managed to nab some of my fees there. That was very smart.
There you go.
Welcome back to the Immanuel Ezekiel Show. Started, of course, as Immanuel Ezekiel, being recorded by Immanuel Ezekiel and sound and camera by Immanuel Ezekiel.
But I think one of the other points too is that with a lot of the planning side is, we look at the planning regulations and all the guidelines and all the bits and pieces, but most of these things are interpreted to a degree by humans, and that's Absolutely. Where a planning consultant can come in and either have a relationship with them or is so used to using them that actually they can get things done a lot quicker, and they know how to present things. And I think that's one of the big problems with planning is that if you just think that it's a mathematical equation, it's not. It's human, talking to human, and it's that, when that element comes in, there's variables.
Yeah,
but everyone's different. I think everyone, Brett, comes at it from their own side, their own training. I was very fortunate to work with some really great people as I was learning, and I was being brought up as a junior planner. I started at the GVA Grimley, and that period I spent in doing asset valuations in the valuation team in the city office, and then went on to the agency team, was really good because I think it helped to shape my sense of what works from a commercial point of view as a planner. I think it also took off some of the edges about my training as a lawyer, because planning is a legal system essentially, but it's also, as you say, it's got that human interface to it. There's an old saying to do with planning, that planning and planning in the law is just wishful thinking. So basically, you need this legal system around it to give it teeth. But you've got, as you say, that human dimension that means that you can get that inconsistency. It's a bit like football referees. I mean, we all pull our hair out in terms of the inconsistency of footballing decisions sometimes. And you go to one council, and if they are just minded to give you permission, they won't look for problems. But if they are minded to if they're minded to make life difficult for you, they'll look for the other decision that goes the other way if they possibly can, and they might make life difficult for you. So, there are those times that you have to make a commercial decision. You have to step back and you have to think to yourself, well, listen, it doesn't make much sense to us, but it is a bit of a negotiation in a way. And you've got to stop at some point and say to the officers, well, what are you looking for? What do you want? Because they have this body of law and guidance and policies, and most of the times they're just trying to justify that to get to the objectives that they want. So a lot of the time, it's asking them, it's working with them and saying, what would you like to see delivered here? But also trying to put that in a commercial context so that it works for you as well.
So can I just add something else in? Obviously, as a developer, I have lots of different schemes in with different planning authorities. And my experience over the years is that planning officers often change. More recently, they're not that experienced. And by having a planning consultant, by putting the application in the best way with a planning consultant, is that if you do get refused, you have enough information to win on appeal. So having that correct structure and providing all the information, it makes it very easy to go through to the appeal and get that done very quickly.
Strategy, isn't it? Yeah.
It's very much a strategy. It means that, because not all planners do the right thing. And we know that lots of plans that have been rejected get approved on appeal. So employing a planning consultant right at the outset to work in conjunction with your architect, one, gives you the best possible opportunity of getting planning the first time round, but more importantly, gives you the best opportunity of winning on appeal.
But we're all salesmen, and we're all salespeople to a certain extent. We all got advocacy skills, we've all got persuasion skills, we've all got to, whether or not we're negotiating and dealing with vendors or with our funders or with the banks, or whether or not we're dealing with the local authority as well. It's just understanding what the motivations are from the other side and trying to work with that. But you're absolutely right. You also have to play the long game to a certain extent. And where you see that there's a potential for a council to go and try and take another route, you've got to try and cut off those escape routes as you go along and steer them in a certain path if you possibly can, and take that. It's good advocacy in a way, and that's part of the training that I had.
I'm now going to ask you a difficult question, which you may or may not have the answer for.
I know that question.
You don't know.
Why am I wearing 2 watches? Why am I double wristing?
Well, again, unbalanced then.
He's a
So
double wrister.
I want to ask you this question because it's quite an important question. We've now seen the landscape of the UK change quite considerably because of COVID. We're seeing the high street and what I think is the demise of the high street, as well as lots of hospitality like pubs and so forth, where they will not be able to cope with the new guidelines and changes. What do you think the planning policy will be to allow, because we know that lots of pubs, they're not like to change of use, they have a premium marketing. So where do you think the landscape's going to change? One, for the hospitality pub sectors, for small pubs that were just about making ends meet before COVID, as well as the high street and maybe some of the change of uses. Where do you think that might be, and where the time scale might reduce in terms of having to market and show that it's no longer viable?
Well, there's several questions in that, but I think what I'd start off with is that basically no one knows really what's going to happen. 2 months ago, there were people presenting this curve from Oxford Research Institute saying we're going to have a V-shaped bounce back and spin into 5% growth by the first part of 2021. And then within a month later, those same people were saying, well, maybe it won't be a sharp V-shaped recovery, it'll be more of a U-shape. And then now you've got the Bank of England revising its own projections and saying, well, maybe the recession's not going to be as deep as everybody knows. No one knows, really. And there are smarter people than me who keep on getting it wrong. So if I was looking to do my own developments right now, which I am, I would be looking for sites which are certainly in town centres, but probably if they are in town centre areas and more core town centre, there's not much you can do with the retail at the ground floor at the moment, because if there is going to be a shift of planning policy locally, most local authorities are a bit set in their ways. They just see A1 shops and town centres and they kind of go together as hand and glove. And they've almost got to see that structural change begin to fail and the impact upon their town centres generally before they basically begin to face up to the reality. Some have already started doing that. Areas like Slough, for instance, they've got regeneration plans and they've been trying to push that forward. I think you're probably, if they are going to move towards policies which allow more flexibility in retail uses or the community uses like pubs, it might be more towards co-living schemes. So you don't get this sudden and abrupt change towards residential where there might be more dead facades and a loss of vitality at ground floor. You get more of a mix of uses. And that, I think that fits in very well with the sustainability agenda, cutting down transport and travel distances between places of work and play and living. Even with offices, I don't think it's such a clear-cut thing. I think it also depends upon where you are. I think in London and some of the major conurbations, you see a higher density of office occupation. So you have a different problem, certainly over the short to medium term with COVID, about distances between workers in the office place. If you're in somewhere like Basingstoke or Guildford, or maybe a bit further out as well, I think you see a lower density of occupation that might be easier to sustain an office operation in those places. And I think culturally, people have started to get more used to working from home. They've seen how it works for them. A lot of them are reluctant to go back to their offices, to be quite honest. That might change after we get out the good weather. We don't know. I mean, a lot of this is seasonal. They're just happy being in furlough and doing nothing and being in the park and being paid for it. So, I think it's difficult to tell. I am looking for peripheral retail sites on the edges of town centres where there's a greater scope of doing something at ground floor by PD, working the upper units under PD as well, and with the government possibly bringing forward further reforms to add floors to buildings, we reckon later this year, then there's potential to increase floor space. And if you choose the right area, you might also benefit from longer term increases in capital values as some of these places get regenerated, or in rental values as some of them get regenerated as well. If you're really lucky, you'll be sitting in the middle of Barrett or Redrow's next scheme, and they'll have a ransom on them. Sometimes it's as strategic as that. So that's probably where I'd look at the moment. I still wouldn't plumb too quickly for pub schemes and the like, because I still think that there's a huge resistance, generally speaking, to lose community uses. I think one thing we've seen out of COVID-19 and the general sense of people wanting to bring community together, the clapping for carers and things like that as well. People are a lot more aware of that, a lot more conscious of that, and I think that there is a stronger sense amongst some people in the community that they don't want to feel a loss of community and disenfranchised in that way. And I think that filters down to these kinds of assets for community value. And people will become a lot more vocal about the loss of their local boozer, for instance. I mean, so many people have said, God, I can't wait for the pubs to reopen. I miss going there. So, whether or not they can actually drink there and their pubs are actually making any money is neither here nor there to some people who always said, oh, I can't wait to get back to my local. You were never there in the first place. That's why they're all going bust. But I mean, that's the irony of it. But they will be the quickest people to write a letter complaining that they're going to lose their local pub.
Yeah. So I know we've been on here for a while, and I'm just conscious of time. A couple of questions I know that we've been asked by people before we were going to do this is, what size of project, how small before, or how big before I should start employing somebody like yourself?
Well, different planning. I can't speak for other planning consultants' business. We'll look at stuff which either conversions, don't tend to look at extension projects all that much, just a house being extended, but we will look at some.
But should people look at a consultant for that? That's kind of what I'm asking.
I think in terms of even house extensions, I think it's worth looking to a consultant for that, because a consultant will be able to advise you on the PD rules. And again, it's to do with an area of law, of planning law. And architects are great at space, but they don't necessarily know the PD rules, which themselves are not just a pure tick box exercise. They're open to interpretation. And I've seen architects get it wrong as well, or they miss things, or they've drawn the plans in the wrong way, or they haven't presented them properly to the planning officers. So, I mean, the thing is that even with the smallest stuff, how local authority departments tend to resource this stuff, as they often tend to get the most junior members of the team involved on those projects. So they are the ones where there's likely to be the greatest mistake and the greatest need for a more authoritative steer through the application.
And area specific. So obviously you do a lot of stuff in and around North London. So that's why we chose you for the North London Hotel. However, I live up in Stamford. Would I be recommended to use you or somebody local who understands and knows the local council and the local planning guys? Is it area specific?
No, not necessarily. Immanuel and I actually sat in on a recent poll that was done in one of our mutual groups about what's most important in selecting a planning consultant. And some people said the relationship that they have with the planning officers. I would say the most important thing is knowledge of the policies. You can get on with a local planning officer like a house on fire, but if you've got a scheme that makes absolutely no sense commercially or in policy, then there's absolutely no point in going ahead. There may be a great guy, but as I heard it said before, great guy isn't a job description. So you've still got to know your beans. I deal with projects all over the country where I've had nothing to do with that officer or that local authority before, and we've still got it through, as complicated as they are. You learn on the job sometimes pretty quickly. It can help sometimes if there's been a history of the awkward squad at local level to bring in somebody who can get over those parochial default positions and they can say, well, we will lead on the design or on the planning locally, and then you have somebody maybe in London who sees things in a different way, who works as part of that team. So that may be the case. I've heard situations of somebody saying, "Oh, I know the officers here. I know them there, and I know them really well." But quite frankly, staff turnover is pretty high in most local authorities anyway, so they might not necessarily know who the hell they are. And the other thing is that you don't know under what circumstances those people left. So they may be spinning you a lie, and don't know who they pissed off on the way out the door.
Yeah, what I'd probably add, it's more important to have a local architect, not necessarily a local planning consultant. The planning consultant bases things around law and understands the policies, whereas the local architect might have that relationship, but having the planning consultant alongside, it doesn't really matter if he's local or not. It's more important.
It's a very good point. We often work like that as well. We'll often work with a local architect who might actually also be the planning agent, and that's also a good way of managing the client's costs and risks as well.
Good. So, a couple of questions before we sign off. What do you like most about what you do?
Well, I would say being out on site and being outdoors, but that's not really been true in the last few months. I actually like the wins. I'm actually quite a competitive person. So there's nothing better than getting a planning permission or a PD through. And when I don't get it through, I get a bit irritated, to say the least.
There's nothing better than having a planning consultant who's competitive and wants to win.
Yeah.
And what do you like
least? It's not a bad thing.
Yeah. What do you like least about what you do?
Well, it would be too easy to say, refusals and stuff like that. But I think not to be too trite about it. Sitting down and just going through the reports and writing them out is hard work, and it's draining. For some people, they love it, but I actually prefer being in front of people and being face to face with people. And I think also when you're in front of officers, you can read them better than in front of email as well. But that's just more to do with my character.
You'd be a great planning consultant for anyone because you love winning and you love dealing with people. What better way?
Not bad.
Sounds good.
Not bad.
So,
yeah.
Talking about networking and how these things come about, I was introduced to David through Simon Wilson. When Simon Wilson was doing his touring that we put him on. So it's just amazing how people get introduced to you and become part of your network and your area of knowledge and expertise. And just going back to the conversation we had before we started the podcast, I was actually walking down Tel Aviv Beach without my top, and I met David without his top on Tel Aviv Beach. So you just never know where you're going to bump into people where you least expect it.
Post lockdown
conversation before, yeah.
Post lockdown, I wouldn't recommend that view as far as I'm concerned. But yeah.
Well, listen, David, it's been awesome, mate. I've actually learned something from you. I'm sure everyone else has. Boys, Immanuel, Brett, I hope you're enjoying lockdown. It's easing soon. Let's get down to the pub. Obviously, the pub that we have in Tottenham is opening up soon, July 4th. So, any additions, boys, before we sign off?
No, that's awesome.
No, just enjoy the weather, and let's hope we get over COVID quickly and start making money again.
David, if anyone wants to get in contact with you, how is the best way to get in contact with you? Obviously, to talk about projects that they have on the go at the moment where they may need some help. We don't want to just call them up for a little chat.
I'm on Facebook, LinkedIn, or my email address, which is david@drkplanning.co.uk.
Good man. So you're on Facebook as David Kemp, and any other business pages or anything like that?
I've got DRK Planning, but you can get in touch with me personally as well via that, and then of course LinkedIn. which I think it's /D Kemp or David Kemp. I can't remember which one, but
and what we'll do is on the Wealth and Success page, we'll put your details up there as well, and put them out so you've got your contact details there as well. But mate, thank you, much appreciated.
Thank you. I'm grateful. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. See you, boys.
Yeah.
All the best.
See you soon.
Cheers. Bye.
Enjoy the weather.
Bye-bye.